Right, so hello everyone, and thank you for all of you who've joined us this afternoon. It looks like we're just slowing down with people joining us, so we'll get started. My name's Laurie Barnes, and I'm the CTO at Automate UK. I'm here just to do a quick introduction and then hand over to David and Grant, who are presenting this afternoon. Just before we do that, there's just a couple of quick housekeeping notes to make. So please add any questions you have to the Q&A tab, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer these at the end and then go from there. This session will be recorded and it will be available on our website later on in the week. So if you have any colleagues that you think worthwhile listening to this webinar, then let them know, and then they can just watch that at a later time. There will be a brief feedback form at the end of the presentation. So if you could please complete this would be really, really great. It's really useful for us. One of the more important questions is what topic would you like us to cover in webinars in the future? This really helps us to know what we should be tackling in the coming months. So please fill that in. I'm very pleased to once again thank Rockwell Automation for providing us with the pre-release copy of their ebook, A Guide to the Machinery Regulation. We released this on our website in September, and it has led to these the previous and this webinar on the topic. David, who presented in the last webinar, has worked for Rockwell Automation since 1999 and is responsible for the EU regulatory affairs for Rockwell, and is ideally placed to speak on these changes. He's joined today by his colleague Grant Coffin, also from Rockwell. He has over 30 years experience in the industry and 16 at Rockwell. In his current role as business manager for intelligent devices, software and control, he collaborates across the industry sectors to develop robust automation and information strategies. So we're not wanting to waste any more of your time with these two experts that we have here today with us. I'm pleased to hand over to David to start this afternoon's webinar. So thank you, David and Grant, and over to you both.
Thank you, Laurie. Well, you've covered that part already. I sit on a number of technical committees across ISO, IEC, CENELEC, and a number of UK committees. And you've heard about Grant already, and Grant will introduce himself shortly. So today's webinar, we did cover the machinery regulation last month. The safety requirement is brand new and forthcoming, which is 1.1.9, and the amendment to 121. And then I'm going to talk about the interplay with, and I've talked at the first slide talked about future regulation. These are current and future in terms of their application date. So CSA, NIS, and CRA. And then a little bit about standards, and then where Grant feeds in is more about the kind of practical aspect. So I'm looking at this from a legal and standardization view. Grant is able to look at this through the prism of industrial automation. He's a feet in the street, and he knows control systems. So machinery regulation, as I said, we covered this before. If you've not had a look at the new machinery regulation, it entered into force this year and has an application date of January 20th, 2027. So it's not far away from when it applies. There's a number of new essential health and safety requirements, but like I said, the one I want to focus on today is this one. It talks about protection against corruption. It's essentially cyber security requirements. So this is the first time we've seen any cyber security requirements related to machinery. It didn't exist before in the existing machinery directive. So just some of the text, the machinery or related product shall be designed and constructed so that connection to it of another device by any feature of that connected device itself or by any remote device that communicates to the machinery or related product doesn't lead to a hazardous situation. That's quite a broad sweep of the brush there. I think I said before, we tried to change the language here of this paragraph, because that's actually quite a hard requirement. If you connect anything to your machine, you've got to guarantee it doesn't lead to a hazardous situation. We all know about kind of cyber attacks, and that currently is out of scope of the Machinery Directive. We don't look at any kind of nefarious actions, whereas come 2027, we're looking at kind of criminal attacks on a machine as well. So it's quite nebulous, the requirement there. We are currently working on a brand new guide to the forthcoming machinery regulation to try and get some of that language so it's understandable for people. How do you interpret this particular paragraph? And we'll as we get that evolving, we'll be able to communicate that with you as time goes by. In terms of scope, we have hardware components in there, and it has to protect against accidental or intentional corruption. Corruption is the broad term. That could be cyber, but in the case of accidental, that could be many things. And again, we need some guidance to that. We also have to collect evidence of legitimate or illegitimate interventions. Again, that can be quite a broad requirement, and we're trying to detail that in some of the standards, which I'll come to shortly. Included in the new machinery regulation is requirements for software and data, and again, that isn't in the current machinery directive. And again, there's requirements there to protect against accidental or intentional corruption. The second paragraph here is slightly easier. You've just got to be able to identify the software on the machinery related product. That's fairly easy to do. And information is available in an easily accessible form. And we know we can do digital signatures, we can get QR codes for CE marking now, it's allowed. And again, in terms of the software, we've got to cover legitimate or illegitimate interventions. And I can tell you right now, the conversation on what exactly an intervention is has been a debate for about the last 6 months in our standard, where we're developing the guidance on this. And again, we could come back to that. We already have a control system in the existing machinery directive. It's just been extended to cover foreseeable malicious attempts. Again, that's brand new. It was always kind of intended influences, unintended external influences, but now malicious attempts is in scope. And in terms of the control system, we have to have a tracing log, and we've got some life cycle aspects now for machinery. Previously with the machinery, or currently with the machinery directive, you affix your CE mark and you're kind of done. There's now some kind of life cycle management for machinery moving forwards, and that tracing log has to be enabled for 5 years. And again, we're trying to work out the information behind that. So it's not an awful lot. We've got one brand new EHSR and a modification to an existing one. But in 5-6 paragraphs, we're going to generate probably about a 100-page standard to give some guidance on that. And again, I'll come back to standards. Why is it important? I think we can all look at this. This is some of our products. Everything's connected, but of course, connectivity can introduce the potential for risk for cyber attacks. So that's the machinery regulation, kind of very quickly done. How does that then interplay with existing proposed regulations? So I've just pulled this off the European Commission and their approach to cyber. We'll see some of these terms come up again. I'm sure Grant will cover it, where we talk about prevent, detect, respond, deter. This is a member state level, this slide. So you can see some things that probably won't affect you as an OEM or end user. The Cyber Solidarity Act, I mean, that bubbled up on the back of the Ukraine-Russian conflict. But you see some other bits of regulation there and directives with NIS2 and the Cyber Resilience Act. So I'm just going to pick out 4 of them. There is, I had a look through the rolling plan, and there was 36 initiatives that related to cyber. The four that I'm showing here, NIS2, CRA, CSA, and the MR, will probably impact you directly, some of them less so. So what are they? So the Cybersecurity Act, that was approved back in 2018, and then we had the CSA, and then we had a modification to the Cybersecurity Act back in January. And I think the important thing to note there is application date of February 2025. And you can see there, what is the CSA? It's an EU-wide certification scheme, and that's where we bring in NIST, the European Union Agency for Network and Information Security. Now, some of the products that they're looking at under the common criteria and common evaluation scheme, and we talk about AVA VAN 1 to 5, is probably again out of scope for some of your products, but it is worthwhile looking at it in terms of the self-certification route. If you've got products that fall in the scope of CSA, there is no self-certification route. You've got to go through a certification agency. But there is some independent voluntary stuff that you can do. So we're monitoring that. So certification is one part of it. The next part, if you're an end user, and by extension OEMs, is the NIS or NIS2, so Network and Information Security Directive. So it's a directive and it's transposed into national law by the member states. The UK had already adopted NIS. We're still looking to see what happens with NIS2. Maybe come back to that later. That's been around again since 2013. The NIS2 was published in 2022. You could read that as 2023. And then the important date was the 18th of October last month, when the NIS directive was repealed and replaced by NIS2. And what's happened there is there's an expansion of sectors. So we had essential entity, for example, it's now expanded to cover food manufacturing, chemicals, wastewater, and generally manufacturing is in scope there. And we also had, if I just go on, oops. We also had the implementing regulation, and we talk about N2IR, that has security measures and risk management measures, has also come into effect under this too. Some of the timelines, if you're interested, you may get some of this from customers in Europe. There is some registration obligations for entities, and you can see the timeline there. Earlier this year was Hungary, and then we start going into next year, Czech Republic, Ireland, Sweden, Croatia, Italy. Belgium is an interesting one. That has a registration obligation of 18th of March, but that was the first member state that transposed the directive into local statute. And if anybody's interested about NIS2, I would say go and have a look at the Belgian website for their transposition. They've got a lot of good information there. They have a scheme that they call SciFun, maybe not so fun, but Cybersecurity Fundamentals. And it has a whole series of checklists that they're mandating end users follow. So I wouldn't be surprised if a number of end users then use that to provide to OEMs. One thing to note, with this being a directive and not a regulation, there is disparity between the transposition status and the content of the transposition. And we did have a date of application of 17th of October, but we know France and Spain are already saying they've not met the deadline, and they're looking at some point in 2025. There's also another point there where we have transposed the directive into national law. Some of them have just done it directly. It's not given any further information. So there's a number of end users still wondering what they have to do under NIS2. So that's certainly a directive and a national implementation people have to keep an eye on. What I guess is the important thing is that the Cyber Resilience Act.
David, sorry, just before you move on there. Yeah, obviously there was another omission there that was quite glaring, in that the UK was missing. So what does that actually mean for the UK?
So, September we had the King's Speech. I don't know if anybody had a look at that. There was two pieces of legislation proposed in there. One was for the UK to write its own legislation, and that's going through the House of Lords just now because we were tied to Europe. The other important thing I noticed in there, previous to well, as discussed in the last government, where there was no commitment to follow anything that's developed in Europe, they now say that they can develop their own or indeed follow European legislation, which I thought was interesting.
So, sorry,
because
David.
Clearly from an industry. Yeah.
Sorry, David, could you turn your camera off because you do keep going a bit funny on the voice again.
Okay, let me just
Thank you.
switch that off. Okay, I don't know if that's any better, Laurie.
Well, we won't. Only time will tell.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, Grant. So within the King's Speech, there was a note there for cyber and the Cyber Resilience Bill. I wouldn't be surprised if the UK government dress up NIS to the same in the UK, and certainly from a Cyber Resilience Act perspective, I'm pretty sure that would be the way we would go. Otherwise, we've got huge divergence for industry. Okay.
Okay.
So then the CRA, you notice we have a title now, so 2024-2847. CRA, in essence, lays down rules for placing products on the market. So this relates to products with digital elements, so anything that's remotely connected. You're going to have to CE mark these products. It lays down essential requirements for the design, development, and production of the products. There is also some requirements for vulnerability handling, and then there's some rules on market surveillance, and enforcement is another one. So they've certainly adopted a carrot and stick approach here. There's some fairly large punitive fines associated with the CRA, up to the kind of realms of kind of £10 million fines, €10 million fines. So latest news, 23rd October, we had the CRA enter into force, and then it was listed in the official journal just last week. And we have some commission continuing to do some CRA guidelines, and we've already seen some secondary acts. So we've got an implementing and delegated act associated with the CRA. 2026 will see some requirements for vulnerability reporting for products with digital elements. And then the main provisions of the CRA apply in December 2027. So you can see there's a bit of a stack of legislation coming down our way from the machinery regulation, early 27, aspects of NIS 26 and 27, and then the CRA at the end of 2027. And just to give you an idea, what does that look like? We do have the chances of a fragmented regulatory landscape. So looking at some of the legislation that now relates to cyber and products with digital elements. So we have NIS2, we've got the Cybersecurity Act, which is your certification schemes. We have the machinery regulation that entered into force just recently. We have the Radio Equipment Directive, and there's a delegated act that deals with cyber for radio equipment. The General Product Safety Regulation has provisions for cyber and AI. and probably the main one is the Cyber Resilience Act, which is a horizontal piece of legislation for ICT products. And it is a regulation, there is no transposition into national law. And then we have the national legislation where we have disparities between some of the member states, certainly related to NIS. So as an example with France, they're potentially going to have conformity with specific rules drafted by ANSSI. And there's already some differences when we talk about cybersecurity labelling between the UK and Germany as an example. So we've got fragmentation on some of the regulation in terms of we can have dual regulation applying to the same product. In fact, sometimes triple regulation, and then national fragmentation where it could change from member state to member state. So it is certainly a challenge. Just looking at the RED, there is a standard. It's still going through. It failed its HAS assessment the second time round. But the goal there is to have a harmonised standard that you can follow, in this case 18031-1, to address the cybersecurity requirements for radio equipment. And that's been used as a reference point for other technical committees, which I'll cover in a second. And I've already talked about the machinery regulation, but 50742 is the harmonised standard that we're looking at there for the machinery sector, specifically 1.1.9 and 1.2.1. So I've talked about standards. Here's a bit of a snapshot, ones that are of interest to this audience. So CENELEC TC44X Working Group 3 is defining requirements for protection against corruption. I'm convening that particular group. We've got maybe 10 or 11 national standards bodies active on that, UK being one. And we are at the moment proposing two routes. So route A, if you're already using 62443 for products, you'd follow that route with some additional requirements for the machinery regulation. If you're an OEM that doesn't use 62443, there'll be some homegrown requirements in the standard as well that you can follow. Then we go into the CRA. So we've moved away from just dealing with the essential health and safety requirements to a broader scope in that regulation. And there's a CENELEC Joint Technical Committee, Working Group 9, that is dealing with the standardisation request associated with the CRA. And that's going to provide some horizontal standards that give reference for development of further vertical standards under the CRA. And then finally, there's TC65X that's responsible for adopting the IEC series into the European market. So we're going to have ENIEC 62443-4-2 as an example. Just as a reminder for 62443, because it's referenced in many, many standards, you can see part 1 is general, part 2 deals with policy, kind of system integrators, and then part 4 is product development. So there's a lot to cover there, done really quickly, just to kind of touch on the surface. And I guess the question would be, I guess, yeah, so what next? And that's maybe one for you, Grant, from a practical standpoint. So let's assume a number of the audience here are OEMs. So, what do they need to do? How do they comply from your standpoint practically? And I'll hand over to you as well, Grant.
Okay, thanks. I'll just share my screen now. Just verify you can see that, David?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, good, okay. Yeah, so it's an interesting question, one I get asked on a regular basis, yeah, I guess the first point is that there's no silver bullet, right? And I guess from an engineering point of view, we tend to focus generally on physical consequences, you know, of an event. Yeah, so if we're talking about cyber, you know, what happens there. I find this quite difficult to communicate, you know, when I'm talking to non-technical stakeholders in an organization, because generally speaking, they don't get into that level of detail. So I tend to focus discussions around, you know, what the impact is on your business, right? So and what the impact is to business continuity. You know, what are the consequences and risks of an event. Yeah, and again, you know, something else that we talk about. You know, there's a lot of cyber which is focused on, you know, the big, you know, state-sponsored or you know, large criminal gangs that are producing malware or ransomware to take over systems. You know, a cyber event in our world, yeah, in industrial automation is an event that interrupts the function of the network or the function of the system through electronic means, right? And those can be deliberate, or you know, or somebody just potentially doing the wrong thing, pressing the wrong button. So, you know, what is the impact, yeah, in terms of the consequences of something like that happening. So I guess, you know, David's talked there a lot about, you know, the legislative requirements, but for an OEM, what, you know, where does the value lie? What if I'm sitting as an OEM, how does it benefit me to go and start looking at this and actually, you know, how do we start looking to put a value spin on this, if you like? So being or having a level of cyber maturity as an OEM and how you build your machines, you know, provides you with the ability to show an understanding of, you know, you have an understanding of security and the policies and procedures that builds first and foremost trust with your, you know, your end user customer, right? Because at the end of the day, when we look at things like NIS and NIS 2, you know, the obligation for compliance actually sits with the end user, right? They're going to ask you as OEMs, or give you a set, or should give you a set of standards. Now, you know, we know that that's going to be difficult, certainly in the early stages of this being rolled out. You know, we know that end users are going to come and perhaps not know what they're looking for. So having a level of you know, knowledge and understanding there, you know, gives you a front foot position. It also shows you can innovate confidently in a secure environment, right? I mean, technology is moving so fast now. You know, people are continually trying to move to, you know, sort of industry 4 methodologies, autonomous operations and that type of thing, which requires significantly more network and communication and data movement and all that good stuff. So you know, you as OEMs need to be able to operate and provide best in class in terms of the machines that you're supplying. So, you know, being able to comply with that from a cyber perspective also, you know, is also a value statement. And then there's that long-term viability, right? You know, what we develop today or what's right today for a security environment won't necessarily be right tomorrow. Yeah, the landscape is continually changing, both from a threat vector perspective, but also from a technology perspective as well. Yeah, and security is foundational then to that digitization process, right? So, you know, again, having a knowledge and understanding of what you need to do, you know, provides that competitive advantage. Now, we look at that and we say, right, it's a complex environment. You know, we've got, you know, I learn everything, or I learn new things every time David talks, right? Because the regulation landscape and legislative landscape is continually changing, right? And you know, there's as David pointed out, there's lots of bodies of work in there. So, you know, there's an element of, you know, what can we do today? What frameworks are there that we can utilize to help us, you know, comply, right? And I guess the two main ones that I tend to follow, or I tend to to highlight are probably NIST and 62443. So NIST, is a framework of I guess elements that we can apply at different levels, right? And governance kind of sits across the next 5 boxes, if you like. So it's almost slightly independent, but covers what you need to do within or should cover all the your policies and procedures and how that evolves over time, right? Because what you develop, as I said, what you develop today won't necessarily be right for tomorrow. But one of the things is actually knowing what you're using, right? And this goes for end users as well. I've been to many end user sites where, if you ask them for an inventory of what they had on plant, most are unable to tell you, certainly in any great detail, what they've got on site. So understanding what you're using and how you're using it. We then move into that protect. What are we doing? And people tend to overlook. Everybody looks at that. What's the technological silver bullet that's going to help me here? But we then get into talking about layers of protection, if you like. There is no silver bullet. It's often referred to as the Swiss cheese model, right? What we don't want. We know that people are going to be able to breach, certain levels, right? You can't protect indeterminately, what goes on in a system. What we don't want is, by the Swiss cheese model, we don't want a hole that goes right the way through, right? That we can see all the way through. We want our layers of protection, to be able to, if we get through one layer, then we defend at the next layer, right? Is kind of what we're looking to do. And then there's detection and detection-based tools that are out there, but I think probably most importantly is this kind of respond. Yeah, so how do we recognize, a breach or an event? Yeah, and then how do we actually recover from that? Yeah, so have we got appropriate backups? Do we have the inventory capability to replace infected hardware, for instance? So NIST gives you a really good framework as to how to structure what you need to do in that governance program, yeah. And it all starts off with knowing what you have. And then 62443. So David touched on 62443 there in terms of its different component parts. But the most important part is how you certainly from an OEM perspective and from an end user perspective is understanding what your risk profile is. Yeah, so what risk is to a nuclear plant, for instance, is different if you're making biscuits. It's a massively different requirement that's there. So understanding what those threat levels are, what the risk tolerance within a business is, and even in the same sectors, risk tolerance is different. Okay, but I guess from a systems point of view, 62443 looks for I guess 7 different functional requirements, right? And the complexity of implementation of those different requirements across a system, may not necessarily be the same, but they relate to the threat profile and are dictated predominantly by the security level that's required. So security levels run from 0 to 5. So 0 having zero protection, 0 to 4, 0 having 0 protection, and level 4 is really getting up to defending against state adversaries. So those, just quickly, the 7 foundations requirements. Yeah, so the first 3 are split into identification and authentication controls. Yeah, where we're looking to identify and authenticate all users as the first requirement. The second requirement is all based around use control, where we're trying to enforce the assigned privileges of an authenticated user. And the third foundation is system integrity, right? To ensure that we prevent as best possible manipulation, unauthorized manipulation to the system. The next two are based under data confidentiality and flow. So the data confidentiality is to ensure the confidentiality of information on a communication channel or in a data repository, and to prevent the unauthorized disclosure of that data. And then the restricted flow piece is, the segmentation of the industrial control system, using, for instance, zones and conduits to limit the unnecessary flow of data in a particular area. Sorry, just lost my thread there. And then the last excuse me. The last two are then looking at the response and availability. So, timely response to events, be able to respond to a violation. And that's really about, providing notification, raising appropriate alarms and responding accordingly. And then the last one is resource availability, right? To ensure the availability of the industrial control system against, degradation or denial of service, for instance. So those are the kind of key focus areas. Those seven become more, the requirements of those seven become more complex the higher up in terms of the level, the security level requirement that you have. So how do we go about, doing this, right? How do we develop a security strategy? Again, we don't want to, or it's difficult to go and eat the elephant, right? We want to try and break this down into bite-sized chunks. Trying to do that risk assessment, and understanding the policies and procedures that we need to put in place that are associated with those risks. Develop that defense in depth, and I'll touch on defense in depth in the next slide. But yeah, what do we need to do from a defense in depth perspective? And then, where should our focus be? Obviously, we can apply different things, but if it's not on, if we're ignoring mission critical systems just because it's different, then again, that we're kind of burying our head in the sand a little bit and focusing on the wrong stuff. And I guess the most important bit is, again, I talked about that silver bullet. Everybody looks for a bit of technology that's going to solve our problems, but the fact is that our biggest threat vector is human interaction, right? And again, that could be deliberate or just people doing the wrong things. So how we develop a cyber culture within our workforce, within different individuals in the organization and the part they play is as important. And then the defense in depth I talked about there. So again, you'll see policies and procedures are kind of top of the bill, but then how do we physically prevent people from accessing our systems? Again, a really important piece, right, of the defense that we have. And again, different things. So for instance, at Rockwell, we're not allowed to use USB sticks. So we're physically preventing people, from swapping memory sticks, for instance. What do we need to do on the network? In terms of network accessibility, and who has access to that? Obviously, the computer, a PC-based environment, things like patch management and the use of antivirus software, endpoint security. Application, how we develop our applications, how they're validated and authenticated in terms of what should be running, and then I touched on endpoint security as important at the device level. So how do we authenticate a particular device and ensure that that's a validated device? We had lots of this, and I had lots of this during supply chain with the amount of grey market equipment that we saw from chop shops, from East Asia and the like, coming through with repaired or certainly butchered devices that weren't original. So how do we validate it against that? And then, there's another way of breaking this down into how we identify risks and what we need to do in terms of outcome. And again, this just provides a different framework. And, people get hung up on things like penetration testing and things like that. Again, break it down into small chunks, understand what we have, and the vulnerability analysis around what we have. Is it legacy equipment? And if it is legacy equipment, how attached to a network is it? Does it need to be protected? And if it does need to be protected, how do we do that? Yeah, is it just additional physical barriers to entry, or are there other ways that we can do that? So yeah, that's the majority, if you like, of how we want to go about and try and break this. Obviously, it's a really large topic. We can go into lots and lots of detail, but I am conscious of how much time we've got on the call, and I know we do want to leave some time for for questions and stuff. So in terms of what we have and the frameworks that are there, there's lots and lots of tools that are vendor agnostic that you can go out and pick up today. And there's lots of inherent capability that sits within existing technologies that a lot of people just aren't using. If we take some simple applications like switches, for instance, as an OEM, when you ship a machine, are you leaving? You generally don't use all the Ethernet ports in a managed switch, for instance. Are you switching the ports that are not used? Are you electronically switching them off? Are you physically locking them off, or do you just leave them open for someone to plug into? There's lots of low cost, no cost type things that you could be doing as best practice and good cyber hygiene that goes a long way to fulfilling the first steps required in terms of creating a good cyber mature environment. And that's really all I've got, David. And I'd probably open it up for a bit of questions unless you've got a comment.
Yeah, go back a slide again, Grant.
Yeah, sure.
So on that risk assessment, I mentioned 50742. We are currently working on an informative annex, and I think we're calling it to be distinct from the risk assessment that every OEM on this call does with 12100. We're calling it a threat, a kind of security threat risk assessment to make it distinct from a risk assessment in the traditional sense. And in essence, what we're saying is all the hazards that you identify in your risk assessment, you don't introduce any new hazards when you do this, let's call it a security risk assessment, but what it can do is have a hazardous event caused by a cyber threat. So I guess on these, you've got actions, Grant. Is there anything, and let's not be agnostic, but anything we can do as Rockwell to help people there? Is there any?
Yeah, I mean, your things like asset inventory is probably I think is the biggest issue most people have. They tend not to necessarily evaluate the products that they're using certainly from a security and security compliance perspective, right? So things like being able to do asset logs, understand the revision control within that asset. And again, we have tools, things like Asset Center, that allow you to do that. But there's also, again, so Asset Center is a software that you can purchase, but there's lots of non or zero cost things you can do as well. Yeah. So, as part of asset inventory, understanding any vulnerability exposures that exist, on a particular piece of electronics is important, and also what the vendor has suggested to mitigate those. So we do that, for instance, for we publish, or we have to publish, if we have a vulnerability exposed in any of our products, and that appears in a number of different places, and that's part of the nature of what we do from again our cyber maturity perspective, manufacturing product. but we publish that in knowledge base as well. Yeah, so whilst you know, the CVE publications in the US would have that, we would also publish in knowledge base what our what that mitigation would be. You can actually register within knowledge base to get alerts of
So
you know,
just
a push
from
of
a practical standpoint, Grant, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I mean, I can show you that if you just
Because
give me a
that's
second.
one thing that comes up in our discussions within the standards community. There is this perception that you can have a silver bullet, and we push back. Your analogy of Swiss cheese is correct, but somebody penetrates that Swiss cheese, there is a vulnerability identified. It's more, what do we do in terms of response to it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is our security advisory page. So this is now an open page. You used to have to register with our knowledge base to get access to this, but actually you can access this directly now. You just sign up, so you get access to this page. But you can, as you can see here, you can sign up for alerts as well. So within that, you know, as you can see there, we've got a number of alerts there, and they grade them. Yeah, so you can see there. Let's have a look at. There's a critical one for Thin Manager, for instance, and I get lots of phone calls on these because people tend to phone me up. Oh, sorry, that one there. People tend to phone up and not necessarily understand, you know, what the vulnerability is and what it means. So, you know, we tend to get a lot of phone calls. People that are using these systems sometimes take a little panic. And that's the first thing really to look at, right? Is, you know, it's got there in, you know, the higher the score, the more, the greater the vulnerability. But you can see they are known exploited vulnerabilities, right? So this is, has anybody actually exploited this? Do we have a record of it? And you can see there that no. So this is likely to be, you know, somebody sitting in a lab, you know, or you know, we think of kids in a bedroom or whatever, sitting down and trying to hack stuff just for the fun of it. This is probably someone sitting in a lab doing something similar. And as you can see there, we've corrected it, yeah, and there's a workaround. So if I just go to that CVE, and as I said, we publish these in lots of different places, right? So this is the CVE website itself, MITRE. So, you know, if you type a CVE number into Google, it'll give you all these. Yes, it'll come up with a list of places to go. You know, there's the Homeland Security page. Again, it'll give you details of that. So as I said, lots of different resources to go and get that. And then if you did go to knowledge base, well, I think I had the knowledge base page open somewhere. Yeah, so that's the old security advisory index. I've obviously slogged me out, I think. But if I looked for that Thin Manager vulnerability, so there, severity high critical, it's got 2 CVEs associated with it. So that's one of the ones we were just looking at there. It'll tell you all the affected products and versions. So that's the first thing to look at, because actually if I'm not using that version or one of those particular versions, then actually I've got nothing to worry about. And if I am, it tells me there what the corrected version is, and we can go and update. So, as I said, there are lots of, you know, kind of no cost type tools out there that help you do some of this work.
There is a bit in the chat, Grant. If you could paste.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm jumping between screens.
You paste the page for finding that information into the Q&A.
Say that again, sorry.
Can you paste that link into?
Yes, I can paste that link. Yep.
We've just got a question asking for that to get pasted in.
So are we coming to the end there, guys? Have you?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any kind of open questions, Laurie, or
I was going to ask exactly the same. So if you've got anyone who's got any questions, please ask. We've answered a few as we've been going through. The one that was sort of sent through. Oh, here we go. We have one here. So we supply automated storage equipment for the physical storage of goods. We are speaking to a military manufacturer. They want to store their test equipment assets in our machines in different locations within their sites and would like to connect our machines via the company network to its inventory via our software located on their server. So they can have real-time visibility of their assets. How can the machine, which contains a Linux PLC, for example, be validated as safe? I will be able to find out through, will I be able to find out through your knowledge base?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So our knowledge base is only for our equipment. But what you will be able to use, whatever if you're using a Linux-based controller, then whichever software, I'm guessing it will be something like Codesys or something like that you're using. You'd be able to check with the version of Codesys you're using and any particular hardware that you're using it on, whether they have any vulnerability exposes by searching for them, in those sites.
The other one that we was asked was about are there any guidelines for sort of during purchase of machines? Not that I'm aware of. As an association, we've not had really too much from people coming and asking for anything like that, but I have been asked about the NIS2 and how people can actually comply to it, and that was from via members within the UK that have or are affiliated or owned by companies within Europe. So they're saying, well, you need to do this to comply to NIS2, which is coming through. So we haven't got anything at the moment, but maybe it's something that I need to have a look at and maybe produce something sort of during the next year. So is there anything else from anybody?
I think maybe just to say, Laurie, that as you can maybe see from the slides, that this is a fairly fast-moving topic. I mean,
it certainly
is. Just as an example, the GTC, the Joint Technical Committee, they're having bi-weekly meetings and bi-monthly face-to-face over 3 different working groups.
Yeah.
The group I'm responsible for in 50742 is we have a monthly 2 to 3 day meeting where we're elaborating the content. So every quarter almost we take a bound forward. So it is something that people probably need to kind of keep their finger on the pulse, if you like, to see how things are developing, and particularly from a UK standpoint. I mean, I know, Laurie, you and I are on the same committee for the UK for OPSS, and we're watching that space pretty closely. The cyber resilience space. So
yeah, it's definitely something to keep an eye on. We're actually doing another webinar on a similar vein, but from a different direction. It's probably going to be the end of February, and that's actually with, sorry guys, but Siemens. So we're
sorry, Laurie, you broke up there.
Yeah. I thought I did. But it's trying to get this topic from different directions as well. We want to make sure that everybody's seeing this. This is a very important topic, and we do need to keep looking at it. And I think different directions is as important as just keeping on top of it as well. Because I think Stephen said they view things slightly different to yourselves. So it's that sort of way we want to look at it. So everybody, please keep an eye out for that will be next year, and I don't think we'll probably squeeze anything in December. So we was quite quick on the turnaround of this one, which I'm really happy that so many people did actually join. So I'm very, very grateful for that, and hopefully it's been useful. if there's no other questions, which there doesn't seem to be, with just a couple of thanks, then I think we're done then.
Thank you, Laurie. Thanks, Grant.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you.